Have you ever had one of those nights where everything is quiet, the lights are low, and for just a moment, you wonder if your kids ever really saw you? I mean truly saw you. Not just as the person who raised them, paid the bills, showed up to soccer games, and helped with homework, but as someone with thoughts, feelings, heartbreak, and hope of their own? Maybe now they're grown and living lives so busy, you barely get a call. Or maybe you do talk, but it's all surface. How the weather is, how their job's going, whether they finally fixed the leaky faucet. But somewhere deep down, you know they've never really understood the full weight of what it meant to love them and still let them go. See, this isn't about resentment. This is about truth. And if you've reached a point in life where you've chosen silence, not out of anger, but from a place of peace, you're not alone. You might have pulled back, stopped chasing, stopped correcting, stopped trying to prove your point. And even though you said less, somehow, the silence has spoken louder. Let's talk about why. There's a strange belief that time makes people forget, that distance makes feelings fade, that kids, especially once they become adults, just get over things. But that's not how real emotional bonds work, especially not the ones built over decades. Your children may act like they've moved on, that they're unaffected, that your absence is barely noticed. But don't mistake the illusion of moving on for healing. They might laugh louder, stay busier, post more pictures, and chase new milestones. But beneath it all, they haven't forgotten. Because you were never just another person in their life. You were home. They may try to drown out the quiet with noise, fill up their calendars, their minds, their relationships with everything they think will distract them from what they're not ready to face. But quiet always catches up. And when it does, when the world slows down and they're alone in the stillness, that's when your voice comes back. Not in words, but in memory. Maybe it's how you used to stand in the kitchen with your arms crossed, waiting for them to finish explaining a bad decision. Or how you'd sigh just before giving advice they wouldn't take. Or how you held your gaze steady even when their words were sharp. They may not remember the exact sentences, but they remember how you made them feel. Safe, grounded, seen. And now that you've stopped repeating yourself, now that you've let go of trying to fix or rescue or correct, your absence has turned into a mirror. Because silence doesn't erase presence. It reflects it. And the deeper your presence was, the louder your silence becomes. There's a kind of echo that only shows up when things are quiet. It's not haunting, not painful, just real. And real has a way of creeping back in when the distractions fade. Sometimes it shows up in small moments. A song on the radio. A family dinner without your voice at the table. The way the house feels when they visit. Just a little too quiet, a little too still. That's when they realize it. Something is missing. But it's not just something, it's someone. You. You might think they've forgotten the important parts. But what they carry in their bodies, the emotional memory, doesn't go away. They remember the way your voice sounded when you read to them at night. The calm you brought when everything else in life was spinning. The way you stood firm, even when they didn't like what you had to say. These things leave marks deeper than scars. Scars fade. But safety, real emotional safety, stays in the nervous system. It becomes the benchmark they measure every future relationship against, even if they don't realize it. Maybe they've started families of their own. Maybe they parent differently. Maybe they say, "I'm going to do things my way." That's okay. That's natural. But deep down, they know. There's a difference between doing things differently and forgetting the foundation they were given. They know who stood beside them when they were at their worst. Who believed in them when they didn't even believe in themselves. That kind of loyalty, that kind of presence, doesn't just disappear. And you, Whether you spoke 1,000 words or kept your feelings tucked behind a quiet glance, you left an impression. You see, in a world full of noise, of people who overshare and overreact, there's something powerful about restraint. Something dignified about knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the talking. Some people chase attention. Some people seek validation. But you chose stillness. Not as a punishment, not to create guilt, but to make room for growth, for boundaries, for truth. That doesn't mean you gave up. It means you chose peace. You didn't slam doors. You didn't burn bridges. You just stopped standing in the doorway, waiting to be seen. And in doing so, you made space. And space has a funny way of revealing things people never saw before. Maybe now your kids are starting to feel it. The weight of what they once took for granted. The calmness you carried that they didn't recognize as strength. The way you absorbed their storms without ever throwing your own back at them. That kind of calm, it's rare. It's not loud, but it lingers. Because while others may have raised their voices, you raised the standard. You showed them what it looks like to stand firm in love, even when you're no longer standing in the room. There's something you should know. You haven't disappeared. You've imprinted. Not on their social feed, not in the daily news of their lives, but in their hearts, in the quiet places they return to when they're tired, unsure, or feeling lost. You didn't chase them down. You didn't fight to be remembered. You just lived with intention, and that kind of presence never needs an announcement. You see, when a parent stops trying to be understood and instead chooses to understand themselves, that's when the real shift happens. Because eventually, the children grow into a space where they begin to reflect. And when they do, they'll realize the depth of what you gave them. Not noise, not drama, but quiet strength, solid ground. And whether or not they say it, whether or not the words ever come, they know it. They feel it, and they won't forget it. Let's keep going. You might think that walking away from the noise, from the lectures, the corrections, the efforts to prove a point, was just a quiet step back. But for them, it wasn't quiet. It was a shift. It was a door closing gently but firmly. And once that door closed, something else opened. Space. Not the kind of space that feels like distance, but the kind that reveals. Because when you stop filling in the blanks for your children, when you stop trying to fix, guide, or rescue, suddenly they're left with their own reflection. And that can be uncomfortable. At first, they might feel relief. They may even mistake your silence for indifference. But give it time. Silence has depth. Space has a way of holding up a mirror they never expected to see. And when it does, they begin to notice the difference, not just in you, but in themselves. They may not say it out loud, but they remember how they used to feel when you were around. Not just your words, not just the routines, but the feeling of being safe, emotionally safe. Like they didn't have to earn your love. Like they didn't have to pretend. That kind of feeling doesn't fade. It lingers. You weren't the parent who tried to be their best friend. You were their anchor. You didn't try to outtalk their emotions. You made room for them. You didn't react with panic when they crumbled. You stood steady. And in a world where emotional outbursts and attention-grabbing noise are everywhere, that kind of calm, it's rare. And rare leaves an imprint. When you stop playing emotional games, the guilt trips, the passive remarks, the endless attempts to pull them back with pressure, you give them something more powerful. Freedom. But that freedom also comes with reflection. They expected you to push, to pull, to hover. But instead, you simply stepped back. Not in coldness, not in bitterness. Just quietly, deliberately. You stopped playing the game. And because you did, your silence became a message. Not one of absence, but of dignity. It says, I am here, but I am no longer begging to be seen. That kind of message doesn't stir the pot. It stirs the soul. Because when someone stops engaging in the push and pull, it exposes the fact that the game was never needed in the first place. All that was ever needed was mutual respect. They might have been used to emotional dynamics, highs and lows, raised voices, testing boundaries. But you changed the pattern. You stayed steady. And that steadiness is what stands out now. Because it wasn't about control. It wasn't about winning. It was about peace. And peace, when it disappears, makes noise. Now you might wonder, even if you're quiet, even if you've stepped back, do they still think about you? The answer is yes, because emotional memory doesn't work on logic. It works on feeling. Their body remembers what it was like to sit next to you and feel heard. Their heart remembers the way your silence wasn't empty but full of presence. And now, that presence, or the lack of it, shows up in the most unexpected ways. They hear a song on the radio, and suddenly, it's your laugh they remember. They see a certain chair in the house and they remember how you used to sit there, reading the paper, always listening even when you said nothing. They make a mistake and realize, without thinking, they're wondering what you would say, or if you'd say anything at all. These are not just memories. They're emotional reflexes. They don't just remind them of you, they remind them of how they felt when you were around. Because what you gave them wasn't noise. It was stability. It wasn't emotional pressure. It was consistency. It wasn't performance. It was presence. And the human heart? It never forgets presence. Sometimes they'll try to dismiss it. They'll say, "That was then. I've moved on." But the truth is, the heart doesn't move on the way the mind wants to. The heart remembers what mattered, not because it's holding on, but because it was changed. That's what they're feeling now, even if they don't know how to say it. Of course, pride gets in the way. That little voice that says, "You don't need them. You're fine. You're grown." And maybe they are. Maybe they're doing just fine. But even pride has its quiet hours. And in those hours, when the noise dies down and the world slows just enough, that's when their heart starts whispering again. It reminds them of things they wish they had said. Of moments they now understand better. Of the comfort they thought they'd always have and maybe didn't fully appreciate. That's when the real internal tug-of-war begins. The ego says, move on, forget, stay in control. But the heart, the one that still carries your calm, your presence, your steadiness, it says remember. And they do. Maybe they'll never admit it. Maybe they'll wait too long to say it. But they feel it. Deep down, they know they're comparing every interaction with others against the standard you set, often without realizing it. They might even resent you for the silence, confuse it for rejection. But with time, even that begins to shift. Because silence that's grounded in peace, not punishment, starts to make sense. It stops looking like abandonment and starts feeling like maturity, like love without conditions, like the final gift you gave them, the room to grow on their own terms. And one day, they'll understand it. Maybe not in a big moment. Maybe not with some grand apology or emotional reunion. But in a small, quiet recognition that the person who didn't chase, who didn't lecture, who didn't need to be right, that person was the one who truly saw them. And when that realization hits, it won't be loud. It'll be quiet, but it'll be real. Because your silence never meant you were gone. It meant you were strong. And in that strength, they saw something they couldn't name at the time. But now they can't forget. Let's keep going. You might not realize it now, but the most unforgettable part of you wasn't the advice you gave or the chores you did. It wasn't even the lessons you tried so hard to teach when they were younger. It was how you made them feel. You were where they felt safe, even if they didn't always say it, even if they pushed back, tested you, or made you question yourself. Deep down, you were the one place where the chaos could settle. When life got loud, when the world got confusing, it was your presence they came back to. You were steady, reliable. You didn't try to fix everything. You just stood there, calm, like a lighthouse during a storm. And now, that lighthouse isn't where it used to be. You didn't disappear. You just stopped trying to shine your light where it wasn't wanted. You stepped back. You let them steer their own course. But here's the part they didn't see coming. Your silence didn't make you fade. It made you unforgettable. Because real safety isn't loud. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It doesn't shout to prove it's valuable. It just exists, quietly, powerfully, and consistently. Until one day, it's gone. And suddenly, every storm feels a little darker. Every decision feels a little heavier. Every room feels just a bit emptier. That's when your absence becomes a teacher. Not because you left in anger, because you chose to let them figure things out on their own. And in that choice, you gave them one last gift. Space to grow. But not all growth feels good at first. Sometimes it feels like loss. And when it comes to love, especially the kind of love that doesn't demand anything in return, its absence feels louder than any words you ever said. You didn't leave behind guilt. You didn't slam doors. You didn't chase them down, trying to prove you were right. You left quietly, with dignity. You left the games to those who play them, and in doing so, you rose above the noise. Maybe you noticed the breadcrumbs. A text here, a half-hearted comment there. Maybe they tried to pull you back into the same old cycle, the push and pull, the questions without answers. But you didn't bite. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring for your own peace. There's strength in that. A quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. And now, whether they want to admit it or not, that strength has become the standard. They compare you to everyone who's come after. They might not even realize they're doing it. But when someone doesn't respond with patience, when someone doesn't listen with the same depth, when someone makes them feel like they have to earn love, that's when the comparison shows up. And it's not even about you personally. It's about what you represented. Calm, safety, clarity, presence. That's what they miss. And that's what they're struggling to replace. But some things can't be replaced. Because you weren't just a chapter in their life. You were the foundation. You didn't just fill the space, and you were the space. And that kind of impact, it doesn't fade. It lingers. It shows up in their choices, their hesitations, their regrets. It whispers in the back of their mind when the world gets quiet. It's in the way they pause before calling, wondering if you'll pick up. It's in the look they give when someone asks about you. They say, "We're fine," but their eyes say something else. Because memory doesn't always come with sound. Sometimes it arrives like a scent, a feeling, a moment that feels familiar, and they know deep down it's you. Still there, still teaching, still guiding, even in silence. But here's the hard truth. They may never say it. They may never apologize. They may never even acknowledge what they've come to realize. And that's okay, because the goal was never to be thanked. The goal was never recognition. The goal was to love them the best way you knew how, and then let go when it was time. And you did. You let go not because you gave up, but because you grew up. You understood something they're just beginning to learn, that real love doesn't chase. Real love doesn't guilt. Real love says, "I'm here, but I'm not going to stand in your way." It's easy to think your silence went unnoticed. But it didn't. It spoke. And it's still speaking. Because at some point, the people who once took your presence for granted begin to miss the peace it brought. The steadiness. The way you didn't react with anger, even when you had every reason to. The way you held space instead of holding grudges. And once someone has felt that, truly felt that, everything after feels different. Not necessarily worse, just shallower. And the deeper parts of us, they never stop craving depth. So even now, as you move forward, not bitter, not vengeful, just grounded, you carry a kind of quiet power. You don't chase. You don't explain. You don't need to. Because the version of you that once stood waiting at the edge of the conversation has evolved. You no longer live at the edge of anyone else's comfort. You live at the center of your own clarity. And that shift, that calm, unshakable shift, is what they'll remember most. It wasn't the birthday gifts. It wasn't the family photos. It wasn't even the moments when you said, "I love you," though those mattered. It was the way you stayed calm in chaos. The way you kept your peace when everything around you was trying to pull you back into the noise. The way you lived, not to be understood, but to understand. That's what lingers. And that's why you're not just remembered. You're unforgettable. Let's keep going. They still remember, you know. Even if their voice doesn't say it and their actions seem distant, they remember. They remember the sound of your footsteps in the hallway. The way you'd pause before giving an answer. The way your silence didn't feel cold, but strong, like a pause that carried more weight than a dozen shouted sentences. And now they feel your absence. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a loud, grief-filled kind of way. It's more subtle than that. It's in the way they notice the quiet when something hard happens and you're not the one they call. It's in the hesitation when they scroll through their phone and wonder whether they should send a message, and then don't. Because something has shifted. You're no longer where they left you. You didn't wait, hoping they'd turn around. You didn't sit in the past, hoping for recognition or a late apology. You moved. You grew. You healed. And somewhere in that growth, you became someone new. Someone even stronger. You didn't disappear. You evolved. And that realization that the parent they knew is no longer standing in the same place, that's what stings more than any goodbye. Because now, they're not just remembering who you were. They're realizing who you became, and who they lost access to when they weren't ready to value your presence. It's not revenge. It's not punishment. It's simply life. You didn't do it for them. You did it for you. There comes a time when you stop explaining your worth to people who stopped listening. You stop trying to be the one who fixes, reminds, corrects, and comforts. Not because you no longer care, but because you finally understand that some lessons can't be taught. They can only be lived. And you chose to live. To live with peace. To live with clarity. To live without needing to be needed. That doesn't mean you stopped loving them. It means you stopped sacrificing your own well-being to hold space they weren't ready to stand in. So if you ever question whether your silence meant anything, know this. It did. It means everything. Because silence isn't the absence of love. Sometimes it's the most powerful form of love, the kind that says, "I trust you to find your own way now, even if it's without me." And they feel that. Deep down, they feel it. It shows up when they hear your voice in their head, long after the phone stops ringing. It shows up when they're parenting their own kids and suddenly realize they sound like you. It shows up when life gets hard and they wish, even just for a moment, they had listened more closely when you were still speaking. You didn't force those memories into their heart. You became them. By being steady. By being present. By stepping back with grace instead of drama. And now, every person who tries to take your place, emotionally or mentally, They're not competing with you. They're competing with the atmosphere you created. The kind of atmosphere that felt like calm in a storm, that made their worst days less heavy just because you were nearby. That made mistakes feel survivable. That made life feel more solid. That kind of presence, it doesn't go away. It becomes the quiet baseline by which everything else is measured. And when nothing else quite matches it, they begin to understand. You weren't just another figure in their story. You were the one who held the story together. And once that hits, it never unhits. You might not see the tears. You might never hear the words. But the impact, it's there. It's working. Quietly, in the background of their heart. And it will stay. Because you didn't just teach with lectures. You taught by living. You taught by leaving. You taught by letting go. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't need your name engraved on a stone. It's carved into the emotional memory of the people you love. They'll feel it every time they long for peace and remember who first gave it to them. And if you've ever doubted your strength, if you've ever wondered whether your restraint, your quiet, your calm really mattered, I want you to hear this. It mattered. It still matters. Because you weren't just heard when you were speaking. You were remembered when you stopped. That's how deeply your presence reached. So take a deep breath. Feel the weight of that truth settle into your bones. You've done more than enough. And even if they never say it, even if they never find the words, your impact is sealed. Not in what you said, but in who you were and who you chose to become when no one was watching. Your silence spoke the loudest. And in that silence, your legacy was born. If this message resonates with you, if it stirred something quiet but strong in your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Or if you just want to keep it simple, type this one truth. My silence speaks louder. And if you found peace or clarity in this conversation today, I invite you to like the video. It helps this message reach someone else who might need it. And don't forget to subscribe to Strong Elderly Life for more reflections, tools, and strength to help you walk this next chapter with calm, clarity, and pride in how far you've come. Because no matter your age, you are still becoming. And there's power in that. Here's to living with purpose, presence, and peace at any age.